All right, good day, everyone. Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our session today on training for the protection of civilians. Thank you very much for being with us today. My name is Hans Rauw, and I have the honor to moderate this session for you today. I am the program lead for the protection of civilians team at POCS. And POCS is a Dutch international peace organization focusing on promoting protection of civilians and human security through working with partners at the community, national and international levels. The goal for today is to assess the challenges and best practices of contributions to peacekeeping training. And to maximize the time for your participation during the session, I will leave the content to our distinguished speakers today. And I will just like to briefly go to the agenda. Slide, please. Today we will start with opening remarks from the ambassadors and permanent representatives of the Netherlands and Uruguay to the UN. We will then move to our distinguished panel, followed by a Q&A session in which we hope you will all participate. Concluding remarks will be provided by the representative of the permanent mission of Rwanda to the UN and by the ambassador and the permanent representative of Bangladesh to the UN. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. A few practical items for this session. Your microphone will be automatically muted and camera will be switched off during the presentations. This is to preserve bandwidth for people with poor connections. You will be able to communicate with the organizers at any moment via the Zoom chat box. And you can also use the chat box to send questions to any one of our panelists so that we can already prepare the Q&A after. If the internet connection and group size allow us, then we would like for you during the Q&A session to turn on your camera. And of course, when you will be asking a question or addressing the panel, you will be unmuted. We would like to ask you to raise your questions via chat and then raise your hand so we can go by people who have questions in the Q&A. And we want to be precise about this. The presentations of the panelists will be recorded, as will be the statements of the member states, so we can use these afterwards. But the discussion and the Q&A is held under Chatham House rules and will not be recorded. And I will indicate when the recording will stop and start. Then, without further ado, I would actually like the recording to start. And if I may, I would like to give the floor to His Excellency Van Oosterom, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Netherlands to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Hans. I hope everyone can see me because certainly I cannot see myself. Am I visible? Yes, this is very good. This helps a lot. Thanks very much, Hans. And welcome to all the participants, almost 100 people I see in the participants list. And as of now, we're not going to use the word ambassador or excellency anymore. I'm Karel. After me comes Carlos, then Patrick, then Mark, then Lotte, then Robert, and Norbert. So thanks very much for joining us. This is going to be a very interesting informal VTC discussion on how to improve training for protection of civilians, certainly in peacekeeping operations. And if I look at the list of participants, it's very clear that we've gathered here a great group of people who think better training for the protection of civilians is very important, both you individually, but also the organizations you represent. For the Kingdom of the Netherlands, protection of civilians is a key element in peace operations. And if you look behind me, you see the cover of the book I published last month, which is about our year in the Security Council. I put it there on purpose because improving peace operations, certainly to improve their performance when it comes to the protection of civilians, was a key priority in 2018 when we were in the Council. There we started the Action for Peacekeeping initiative, which the Declaration of Shared Commitments, and a number of resolutions, certainly the one of September, where we made a better connection between reimbursement and the performance of peacekeeping operations. In short, in A4P, we try to achieve better mandates, better training, better information setting, and better equipment. But it's an ongoing process. I have to be very frank about that. So at the moment, action for peacekeeping is ongoing. We ourselves, as Netherlands, we are champion for protection of civilians in the current implementation phase. And for instance, together with Pakistan, and I see a colleague of ours is in the participants list, together with Pakistan, we do a PrepCon on that issue quite soon. If we look at the total importance of protection of civilians, we feel very strongly that civil society has a key role to play. And certainly at this moment, this difficult moment in time when COVID is making it difficult, and we see that the Security Council is not doing what the Secretary General has asked it to do, to reconfirm his call for a global ceasefire. I think the civic society and the role civic society can play also in training is a key issue. Let me finish with a number of issues. I see that we have a number of representatives from countries as well. Some key elements we think what countries certainly should do. Providing the troops, certainly more female staff. Secondly, providing essential capabilities. Thirdly, engage common awareness by having the kind of discussion we have today. Fourth, I think we should introduce a system of certification of peacekeepers, certainly when it comes to proactive stance in protecting civilians. And fifth, making available the budget that is needed for peacekeeping operations to fulfill the mandates. And sixth, even further tighten the link between performance and reimbursements. Peacekeepers should not get their money if they don't protect civilians. I think it should be as simple as that. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to a valuable discussion, and it's an honor and a pleasure to give the floor to my namesake and my personal friend Carlos, which is Spanish for Carol. Carlos, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good morning to everybody. I thanks also, well, all my, the other partnership, beginning for Karel, the ambassador of Bangladesh, to ambassador of Rwanda, and obviously the people from PAX. I also pleased to know the participation of highly qualified panelists whom I am certain will bring expertise and also recommendation to improve training for protection of civilians. Karel already mentioned some general points, and this obviously was very useful for me, and I will try to concentrate in this case to providing some Uruguayan perspectives on the importance of training for the protection of civilians, as well as concrete experience from our peacekeeping. The importance of training the UN peacekeeping operation, including the protection of civilians, is unanimously recognized by the UN and its member states. There is no discussion on that. The topic is widely referred to in many avenues, such as in UN policies, in the report Special Committee on Peacekeeping, in the Action for Peacekeeping Initiative, which is, we're more or less under this umbrella is A4P, and also in the Kigali Principle for the Protection of Civilians. Moreover, during the past 20 years, since the first explicit mandate in peacekeeping operation in 1999, it's clear that both the nature and manifestation of conflict, peacekeeping operation, protection civilian, and all of them are evolve in very clear manners. Besides, it's clear that all those concepts will be continuously evolving and offering both challenges and opportunities. In this concept, Uruguay believes that training is one of the critical tools available to UN peacekeeping operation and member states to improve the capacity and efficiency on such complex tasks. That is protection of civilians, and it's because of that that we have the obligation to permanently strive for excellence. I won't dig into details, but it's the key. It is key to understand that training requires partnerships, or recalling that the training is uniformed personnel for deployment to peacekeeping operation is a member state responsibility. The Secretariat, as a partner of member states, is responsible for providing basic requirements and training materials, and for validating that training is being delivered to these standards. The only way to strive for excellence is precisely through enhanced partnership, which is at the core of the A4P initiative. Now, if you allow me, which it could be a little bit longer than I saw, I would like to share with you some of the most recent action taken by Uruguay and directed not only to improve overall training efficiency of our troops, but also to contribute to enhancing training capacity at the UN systems level. Uruguay National Peacekeeping Training Center, ENOPU, is constantly organized courses for the troops, but also to offer other troop and policy contributing countries. For example, last year in Montevideo was held a training of trainers course on the protection of civilians, which the close collaboration of the Department of Peace Operation. Our country also have a national system for peacekeeping operation, SINOMAPA, that brings together key national institutions such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Defense, and Interior, which taking into account of the policy force, to set political guidance on training guidelines. For example, once the updated DPO policy on POC was released by the UN Secretariat, that policy was immediately considered and internalized at the national level. And today, any national course of POC is based on the updated policy. Similar process will occur with the POC Handbook recently distributed. Last year, in support of the efforts of the Department of Peace Operation in the area of training, Uruguay, with the support of the United States, translating to Spanish, core training materials including POC, which are now available to all member states. As a last point, I promise that I would like to offer another concrete example of a national effort to improve how Uruguayan peacekeepers perform child protection tasks. During last year, Uruguay partnered with UNICEF to develop a national policy on child protection for peacekeepers, but could bring together best practice and guidance on how to perform those tasks. After many months of hard work, the policy was officially launched at the end of 2019 with the support of the UK Embassy in Montevideo, UNICEF, and Keeping Children Safe. We encourage all those contributors countries to replicate this initiative, and we are entirely available to share our experience to other member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We would now like to move to our panel. Next slide, please. Thank you. We are very pleased to have our three panelists today who can present from a wealth of experience. They will also provide the various perspectives we need to appreciate the challenges and indeed contribute to solutions together. First, we will hear from retired Major General Patrick Kamat, a former military advisor, force commander, and head of the UN mission in Yemen last year. Major General Major General Kamart will present on the need to be proactive in peacekeeping and what that means for training and preparation. Then we will move on to Mark Patterson, Chief of the Integrated Training Services at the UN Department of Peace Operations. He will present how the UN works on training for the protection of civilians, and he will provide some considerations for member states. We will then have Dr. Lotte Vermeij present. She is a senior advisor for the Norwegian Armed Forces, and Lotte will reflect on practical challenges in training and highlight a few key issues to address through training. Next slide, please. May I give you the floor, Major General Kamart, or Patrick, if I may. Thanks.
Thank you, Hans, for your kind introductory words. Thank you also, PAX and the government of Bangladesh, the Netherlands, Rwanda, and Uruguay to organize this short virtual seminar. And I'm very pleased that I was invited to say a few words today. A few words on the protection of civilians, what is needed to be proactive on POC on the ground, and what does that mean for training. And my intervention will be based on 4 pillars. What is it that we are training for and should be training for? The second is, what is the threat in the environment where peacekeepers will deploy to? The third is, what should be the main focus? And the fourth is, how can troop contributing countries prepare best? Next, please. So let's start with the first pillar. You know, in the Security Council mandate, one of the many tasks is to protect civilians under threat. I would like to say from the beginning, I think it is an implied task, protection of civilians, but 2, it is not only a task for the military or for the police, it is a task, it is a mission objective. It is a mission objective for everybody. And in many missions, this protection of civilians is slightly different. In the mission in South Sudan with POC site, protection of civilian sites, it is different from MONUSCO. And it is different from MINUSMA in Mali, where sometimes the protection of civilians is done by armed groups, signatory to the peace agreement, such as CMA. That is all gives a different perspective on the issue of protection of civilians. And the second point is, when we talk about training and should be training for, is that besides the basic military and police training, you need this specific training for this specific mission. And in all the missions, the red line is that we have to engage with the local population. Next, please. And then the second pillar is next. What is the threat in the environment? The threat in the environment, next, is where do we deploy to? Because nowadays we see, unfortunately, that the United Nations is a target itself. And that means that the training to deploy to those areas is very much influenced by this threat. So that brings me to the third pillar. Next is what kind of, back. Yes, back, yeah. So what is it that in the training we have to encounter these kind of issues of improvised explosive devices? Is an aspect that we really make sure that when we deploy to those missions, we have to train for that. The second is next, is the community engagements and early warning. We must make sure that we have the contact with the local population, because the local population can give us a lot of information, but it is in the training for a mission that we have to train people how to do that. And the third, next, is the mindset of the contingents and their commanders. A mindset of finding the hotspots where things might happen. And if we found those hotspots, we must make sure that we are proactive rather than reactive. And last, on the main focus is that in order to be successful, we have to make sure that we have the proper resources to do so. And it is sometimes extremely frustrating to see that we have excellent plans and strategies, etc., but we lack the proper resources to implement. Then the fourth pillar, next, is how can two contributing countries prepare best? And on that, 4 points. First, we must make sure that we select the right leaders. And that is very much applicable not only for in the field, but also at UN headquarters, because it always starts there. And we must make sure that they are not only trained nationally, but also internationally. We have courses, the United Nations has very good courses, senior mission leadership courses, senior leadership programs. The American government has the Global Peace Operations Initiative with very good contingent commanders courses. All those courses should be properly synchronized and synchronized with an aim of and an eye on the demand to make sure that those leaders have a mindset of being proactive. Next. We must make sure that we have more female peacekeepers, because female peacekeepers have proved in the missions where they are deployed that they are extremely valuable in the whole issue of protection of civilians, because they are the ones who are the best ones to engage with the local population. Third is scenario training. Next, sorry, go back, yeah. Scenario training. Scenario training means that it's not only a PowerPoint and we go through point by point, but we paint a scenario and give a real a case so that people can, the people that are to be trained can feel and sniff the air of a mission and see what is required and what kind of documents are needed to, to fulfill the mission and the situation. Tabletop exercises and exercises where key commanders can visit also the mission and see before they start with their pre-deployment training what is exactly required. That, for instance, helped me enormously during my pre-deployment training for my first mission in Cambodia. And the last point on this one is the lessons learned. Lessons learned from, we had in the last 4 years a number of important reports on incidents in the various missions in Sudan, in Gaza, in MONUSCO, in the Congo and in Mali. And those lessons learned should be incorporated in the pre-deployment training. And finally, next, is this issue of leadership. In all our peacekeeping missions, leadership plays a vital role. And I would remind everybody to this quote of the former Undersecretary General of Peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who said, in peacekeeping, you have a dilemma: to look the other way and have to live the rest of your life with maybe the notion that if you had moved in, you may have made a difference, or you move in maybe with the risk of failure. That dilemma should be on the mindset of all our leaders, military, police, and civilians, when they are facing the protection of civilians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Mark, can I give you the floor? Thank you.
Good morning. Nice to be here and have a chance to talk to distinguished and respected colleagues. I'll spend about 10 minutes talking about POC training. I'm going to cover responsibilities, material, standards, and conclude with some areas where we, and this includes the member states, must act. My key point, and I'm going to return to this repeatedly, is that POC is not a niche skill, and it is not the responsibility of only a few personnel. It's a core skill, and one that all uniformed and civilian personnel must be proficient in, and this includes recognizing the protection linkages in their daily tasks, whether these be peacekeeping intelligence, civil affairs, or UN policing tasks. These protection linkages are included in almost all of our training materials and guidance. Next slide, please. Just to remind, and Ambassador Amarin also touched on this, training. Who's responsible for what? The General Assembly Resolution 4937 gives member states the responsibility for the training of all uniformed personnel. Our responsibility in the Secretariat is to provide materials, guidance, and standards, and to help measures or establish measures to assist member states. These have been reflected in the A4P commitments, which Ambassador Van Oostrom also spoke about. So we have clarity on who does what. Member states do the pre-deployment training, we provide the material. Next slide, please. There are two key documents which provide guidance on the preparation of military personnel deploying to peacekeeping operations. To the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the Operational Readiness Assurance and Performance Improvement Policy. It comes from December 2015. There are two key elements in this policy that I want to bring to your attention. The first is that member states are able to get, on request from DPO, a large number of documents which will help them prepare their pre-deployment training. These documents range from rules of engagement through to the mission mandate, the mission training plan. The second issue, and I'll touch on this a bit more in depth, is that member states are required to certify that they have fully trained and prepared each rotation of a contingent before it deploys. The document to the right-hand side of your screen is the Operational Readiness Preparation Guidelines. These lay out the types of training to be delivered to the various types of unit, ranging from infantry through to special forces and engineers. There's a key point in these documents, in the guidelines. For the first deployment of any contingent, a member state is required to submit to the Office of Military Affairs its final testing exercise. This is a chance for the Office of Military Affairs to ensure that the unit is about to be exercised in the very tasks that it needs to undertake whilst deployed in the field. Next slide, please. This outlines the various phases of pre-deployment and induction and ongoing training. The blue, pre-deployment training, is the responsibility of member states. As we go to the right with induction and ongoing training, that responsibility shifts to the mission. Within the pre-deployment training are four phases. The technical training, this is what we call the green training, the core military skills, the ability to undertake one's basic duties as a soldier or as a police officer. This begins with an assessment of the overall level of skills. The second is the UN-specific peacekeeping training. This covers protection of civilians, conduct and discipline, civil military cooperation, peacekeeping intelligence, etc. The next, mission-specific training, where the training starts to focus on the skills needed to actually operate in the mission. And the last, integration training. This one is particularly important because many member states create units as composites, bringing together companies from various other units. The unit must be able to operate as an integral whole, and it must be able to do that in the various tasks that the mission has to undertake. And as we go to the right, the final phase, the certification, and I'll touch a little bit more in detail on that in a second, and in the case of the first deployment of any country, the pre-deployment visit from the Office of Military Affairs, ourselves, and the Department of Operational Support to ensure that that unit is actually ready to deploy. Then deploys, and the responsibilities shift to the mission for induction and ongoing training. Next slide, please. What you see before you is a range of the materials which are available to member states to help them shape their training. We have the core pre-deployment training material, and as Ambassador Amorin explained, it's now available in Spanish. Thank you to the United States and the government of Uruguay for making that possible. It's also available, will be available in French. We also have a broad range of specialized training materials. And as we look from left to right, opposite the initial CPTM, we see the STM for Comprehensive Protection of Civilians for the Military. This is tactical level training directed at the battalion. Child protection for military and police, conflict-related sexual violence, peacekeeping military intelligence. My point in showing you all of these is that within each, there is protection of civilians elements. If someone is an intelligence officer at the battalion level, one of their key tasks is to do a protection of civilians intelligence assessment to enable that battalion to develop its protection of civilians plan. If you're looking at formed police units, one of the key tasks here, protection of civilians. So protection of civilians is an element in all of our programs. And it comes back to the point that I made at the start. This isn't a niche activity. This is a core activity that cuts through all of our activities and all of our training materials. Next slide, please. I spoke a little bit about the final certification that the member state is to do before its unit receives the pre-deployment visit. There are 6 things on the screen which the member state is required to certify, and this has to be done for every deployment of every contingent. I'll give you a few seconds just to look through those, and then I want to speak a little bit more about the 2 highlighted ones at the bottom. So the 2 that I've highlighted. The first, the unit has to be prepared and tested through self-evaluation and field exercises. I mentioned that many countries create composite units. It's important that unit is able to operate as a synthetic whole, all the way from the battalion commander or the engineer unit commander or the aviation commander, right down to the private soldier. And it needs to be able to do that by day, by night, through the range of activities that unit has to undertake. The second is the country has to certify that that unit is capable and willing to operate according to peacekeeping tactics, techniques and procedures to accomplish the UN's mission's objectives and mandates. That means being competent in the range of tasks required by the mandate. We receive a high level of certifications. 2019, 2020, we're almost at 100%. But we know from evaluations conducted by the Office for Peacekeeping Strategic Partnership, internal oversight, and then special inquiries led by people like General Komet, that in some cases units are not actually fully capable of meeting this requirement. Next slide, please. So now onto some of the more specialized POC stuff. In 2016, 2017, based on our identification of the need to improve the levels of protection training in the field, we undertook a training needs analysis of uniformed personnel and civilian personnel in the field. What we found was that there was a high level of understanding amongst all peacekeeping personnel of what POC was as defined by the Security Council mandates. So they knew what it was. What was missing was the necessary knowledge and the understanding of how to apply that mandate. We also found that a majority of personnel did not know or understand the POC strategy for their mission. They also lacked an understanding of their individual and unit responsibilities to implement the mission mandate. And this included an inability to identify threats, an inability to make plans, and lastly, an inability to actually operate. Our training needs assessment identified 6 key issues, which you'll see on the screen before you. Go back. Thank you. General Komet talked a little bit about scenario training. We've done extensive work on scenario training for leaders, for units, and now for missions, and actually getting them to conduct protection of civilians exercises. We have a new POC policy, and we're now also including the protection of civilians indicators in the comprehensive performance assessment system, which is being rolled out in all of our missions. So we're making good progress on our responsibilities to actually strengthen POC. Next slide, please. We've also just released the POC Handbook, and I'm pleased to say that some of the authors of the handbook are amongst our audience today. It complements and further builds upon the official policy and guidelines on POC. It operationalizes policy and doctrine and guides personnel on what they have to do to actually implement POC. It applies at all levels, strategic, operational, and tactical. As a result of this, we need now to go back and look at our training guidance and training materials to start to update those to make sure that they remain aligned with what's in the POC handbook. Next slide, please. I'd like to finish with some considerations for member states. The first, need to train and exercise the mission and mandate requirements. The material is there to help countries do this. It's available upon request from the Office of Military Affairs. I talked about the list of documents which is available. Last year, 2019, 2 countries asked for those documents, and yet we have about 128 troop and police contributing countries actively deploying in the field. The second, we need to ensure the dissemination of POC standards and training materials to trainers. We know from our own experience that a lot of this stuff doesn't get into the hands of those who actually deliver the training. With the help of member states, we've run a number of seminars around the world to speak directly to the trainers to make sure that they are aware of the materials needed for training and how to get them. We also issue a quarterly newsletter which goes directly to the trainers to keep them up to date with the latest training materials and to maintain a contact with them. We understand that our formal level of contact with member states needs to go through the permanent missions, but we've also found that it's absolutely essential to go through the permanent missions and in parallel go directly to those who are responsible for preparing, shaping and deploying forces. We need commanders who have the mindset to lead. This is a point that General Kamat made, and we can't make it strongly enough. It's a key issue which came out of the Dos Santos Cruz report, which is about mindset, the willingness and the ability to implement the mandate and to lead soldiers and police officers effectively. The fourth point, and I know Lottie will talk a little bit about this later on, countries should be actively seeking to learn from their deployments, to build a lessons learned capacity. And again, with member states' support, we are working on some standard operating procedures which will help countries to actually develop that lessons learned capacity so that they can analyze the experiences of the previously deployed contingent and feed those back into training, as well as identifying well-performing personnel who can be put forward either for more senior posts in peacekeeping operations or into training roles. And the last two go to resources. We need support in the budgetary committees for POC posts in missions. The role of the POC units in the missions is to act as advisors. They don't actually implement the POC mandate, but they need to be able to ensure that there's a mission-wide approach to POC. To give you an example of the dire straits that we are in, MONUSCO, which has a massive POC responsibility, has only 2 budgeted posts for protection of civilians. UNIFIL and UNISFA don't have any posts for protection of civilians advisors. So we need support from member states in the budgetary committees to ensure that those posts go into mission budgets. The second, and this is something that we have learned from MONUSCO, is that missions themselves also require a little bit of extra budgetary support so that they can develop their own mission-specific training. In 2019, with support from some member states, MONUSCO organized its own mission-specific POC training and used extra budgetary resources to bring specialists into the mission to help develop and deliver that training. It was an extremely good and valuable experience. Next slide, please. And I want to close with one thought. And that's, we have to train as we intend to operate. There cannot be a disconnect between our training and our operations. All of the guidance, all of the material is there to enable member states to actually match their training to the operations. And to circle back to my beginning point, POC is not someone else's responsibility. It's the responsibility of every deployed person in the mission. And we need to make sure that every deployed civilian, soldier, and police officer is fully aware of POC and what it takes to actually implement the mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very clear. Lotte, can I ask you to present your thing?
Yes, thank you very much, Hans, for the invitation, first of all, and all protocols observed. I would like to start by thanking POCs, of course, and the governments of Bangladesh, the Netherlands, Rwanda, and Uruguay for bringing us together today and creating the opportunity to discuss how we can improve training initiatives focusing on the protection of civilians. I have been involved in peacekeeping training for the past decade, during which I have worked with national peacekeeping training centers across 5 continents, as well as with our peacekeeping missions in CAR, DRC, and Mali. And against this background, Hans has asked me to focus my contribution on some of the gaps that we find in POC training and how these can be addressed by member states. So moving to the next slide, we can start addressing the first issue, focusing on the gaps in current training programs for POC compared to the practical needs that we find on the ground. As was already highlighted by both General Kamart and Mark, a proactive rather than a reactive mindset is required to protect civilians in missions today. And I think we can all agree that this is a clearly identified need on the ground. Key to this required shift in our approach is a thorough understanding of the POC mandate by all mission personnel. Understanding the centrality of the POC mandate is equally important in this. We know that POC is at the heart of most of our peacekeeping missions today, and it is vital that training prepares our peacekeepers for this, not just with a POC session incorporated in courses, but rather by mainstreaming POC throughout training, including pre-deployment training. The picture you see on your screens shows some of our military colleagues in DRC who indeed play a key role in POC, but it needs to be very well understood by all peacekeepers that POC is not just physical protection. There's a very long list of interconnected issues and activities that contribute to POC, including, for example, activities ranging from political engagement and dialogue with parties to conflict, monitoring of human rights violations, gender-sensitive DDR, water and fire route patrols, and the list goes on. This means that all mission components play crucial roles in POC, and that also takes us to the next slide. This shows you a picture of mission coordination in DRC during the influx that we had of Burundian refugees, and it shows you how different mission components as well as external partners are involved. Unfortunately, one of the challenges that we still face on the ground is that we tend to operate in our silos, whether these are civilian, military, or police. To address POC issues on the ground, continuous coordination is required between these components and external partners, and of course as well the host state. And currently training does not always prepare us well for this. We are all aware that we have very limited resources in mission and that we need to be prepared to use these creatively to maximize our impact. But when it comes to preparation for this reality on the ground, there's certainly room for improvement in current training programs, I would say. During training, our future peacekeepers should learn more about POC being a whole of mission responsibility and what that actually means. And I think a greater emphasis should be placed on the roles that are played by various mission components and how we are dependent on each other to successfully implement our mandates. Going to the next slide. I would like to point out that we are expected to hit the ground running when we deploy to mission areas. For this reason, it is extremely important that those deploying to peacekeeping missions receive more context-specific training. Ideally, parts of our courses or perhaps even additional training modules should be specifically tailored to the missions our peacekeepers are deploying to. The reason I'm saying that is because POC today means very different things in different missions. For example, as you can see on the pictures, POC in MONUSCO, DRC, or MINUSMA in Mali requires very different approaches. And that also means that we need to prepare for those differently. POC is simply not a one-size-fits-all, and it cannot be trained as such either. I would therefore recommend that we adjust our training to local realities faced on the ground. In doing so, I would also recommend that training programs engage trainers with recent mission experience and to invite former deployed personnel and external experts to offer more context-specific insights. There's a wealth of knowledge available, but sometimes we simply forget to connect the dots and it gets lost as a result, which is a real shame. Moving on to the next slide on community engagement, I would like to highlight the challenge of moving from classroom-based training to implementation. Many POC training programs tend to focus on the explanation of concepts, yet we need to make sure that we also train our peacekeepers on how to implement these so that they have the understanding, skills, as well as standards when they deploy. For example, Community engagement is one of the buzzwords we frequently hear about, but how do we actually work on this in different settings, especially given the contextual and cultural complexities that we face on the ground? Again, this requires very different approaches when comparing different missions and should be addressed as such in training. The same goes for identifying and prioritizing POC threats and risks. How does this work? Who should be involved? And how can we effectively feed this into our early warning mechanisms? For this, I would encourage to engage recently or currently deployed personnel and to develop context-specific scenario-based exercises. In addition to those, based on experience, training participants highly value the use of visuals such as photos and videos, but also testimonies from the local population and animations. These kinds of tools, I think, should be used increasingly in training. And I think it's currently a gap. Too much of the work that we do is still PowerPoint based. Moving on to the next slide, I would like to highlight that POC training would also benefit from the integration of other protection agendas. For example, we can talk about child protection, addressing conflict-related sexual violence, gender, but also the broader WPS agenda. These are not separate agendas that can be addressed in isolation. These are all related protection issues that should rather be approached in a joint fashion when we work on POC. And that understanding again links back to the need for a thorough understanding of the mission mandate and its components so that we enable swift coordination and follow-up and thereby hopefully become more proactive as well. The next slide, please. This moves us on to the question what steps UN member states can take at the national level to improve the impact of training on the protection of civilians' capacities of UN peacekeeping operations. The first point I would like to make here is that we really need to engage leadership, as was already pointed out earlier. Leadership of, for example, units that are deploying, they need to be crystal clear on the POC mandate, but we still see that they are often not part of training. And I think that's something where member states can certainly play a role. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important as well that member states and their national training centers ensure that the centrality of POC in today's peacekeeping mandates is taken into account in the training they design and that context-specific modules are offered to our participants. We need to ensure that our training is based on the most recent guidance and that we offer our training participants a curricula that includes UN-developed tools like the UN POC policy and handbook, as was just mentioned by Mark. And again, linking that to other protection agendas. The CRSV handbook that will be launched this coming Friday should be part of that, as well as the child protection manual that came out last year. In addition to that, integrated training that includes military, police, and civilian personnel is highly beneficial, as it allows us to simulate the working environment in peacekeeping missions. In doing so, I would highly recommend that member states engage formally deployed staff in training so that future peacekeepers can learn from the actual challenges, good practices, and lessons learned coming from mission areas. Adding these voices from the field is a much appreciated aspect of training, which allows participants to learn about specific mission context much better. And I would also like to point out that the current situation regarding COVID-19 actually offers opportunities to include more voices from the field in training. We are all aware now that the technological platforms are in place to connect with colleagues from all over the world like we are doing today. And this makes it much easier as well to invite mission personnel to contribute to training with context-specific sessions without putting a burden on the mission by requesting their absence from the mission area. So I think that's a great opportunity. The last topic I would like to briefly touch on is the training of trainers, for which we have moved on to the next slide. Hans has asked me how the UN and other stakeholders can further improve the training of national trainers on POC and other related protection agendas. I think we already talked about some of the recommendations in that field, but in addition to those, I think it is key that we prepare our trainers by making sure that they have recent mission exposure. Ideally, we would ensure that our trainers have recently deployed or conduct at least regular field missions. If that's not possible, I would at least recommend to engage mission personnel in training of trainer programs so that they learn from actual experiences and can use this in their teaching when they continue to train on programs later on. The same, of course, goes for involving external counterparts and experts. We should absolutely draw on their knowledge. The next and the last slide, please. So lastly, I would recommend to incorporate real case scenarios in training of trainer programs, focusing on challenges, good practices, and lessons learned from the field. As Mark has said, we do not always use the examples from missions in our courses, while these are vital lessons to be learned from those experiences. When training our trainers, I would argue it is important to give them the tools to teach in a hands-on manner using practical examples. And I think this is particularly important for today's missions, because the protection of civilians is today so complex that we simply cannot afford to let our teaching be based on textbooks, concepts, and dated experience as well. Mandates have changed, missions environments have become more hostile, and the preparedness of our peacekeepers is perhaps more important than it has ever been before. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Lotte. Much appreciated. Before we go into the question and answer session, a few practical points. Please provide any questions you might have to the panel via the chat function. And we will select questions from the bag and put forward to the panel by 3 questions. Please have your, to allow for poor internet connection still to connect, please turn off your video as if you're not speaking. And to raise your question, besides typing it in the chat function, please use one of the raise your hands options. I believe there is a thumbs up or a wave. Either one will work and will, which will cause you to kind of float up to the top of the 100 participants that we have at this point. We will stop the recording as this interactive discussion will be held under Chatham House rules. Any questions, anything that you might want to address to the panel, please ask via the chat and raise your hands. Q&A section, and I would like to move to the closing remarks. First off, may I give the floor to Mr. Kaina Mura, First Counselor and Political Coordinator, representing the permanent representation of Rwanda to the UN, to provide his closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and very good morning. Good to see you all, colleagues, in good health. And since my duty is to give closing remarks, first I apologize. My ambassador is engaged in another meeting. She would have loved to be here to engage in this important discussion. Well, first and foremost is just to thank our panelists who have done an incredibly good job in terms of looking at peacekeeping and then protection of civilian. What is missing? What are the gaps? What is the difference between mandate writing and then the actual implementation of the mandate? I think this has been the main challenge that has remained key in the Council to member states and all partners in this on this issue. So I think that the panelists have really intersected it very well. Rwanda as one of the true contributors to peacekeeping. Of course, we've learned our own lessons in peacekeeping. The lessons have been very useful to us to better improve on how to engage, on how to execute mandate on protection of civilian, even in peacekeeping in general. So the lessons have been very important for Rwanda and for the peacekeepers for the whole of the time we've been engaged in peacekeeping. I think this is not only for Rwanda, it's also to other member states that are providing peacekeepers and have the mandate to put for protection of civilians. Again, what is key is what the panelists have really explained to us, the gaps that exist. What do we need to do? Where are we missing? What are the challenges? And what stands out again most is what again they have mentioned. Not every scenario is different. And therefore we believe that even in the training before deployment, we need to assess all these different scenarios to be part of the training so that the peacekeepers who are going to do the job, they have the actual picture, not only in words or in the world of ideas, but also in the world of reality, because this is what they will be going to do. And then again, as they have mentioned, the scope and content of the training material need to reflect all those peculiarities, which are new. Country-specific scenario-based training, it will be very important and has been very highlighted. We welcome the idea which has been mentioned, I think in the concept note, the duplication, to avoid the duplication and fragmentation of initiatives. I think there is a need to consolidate resources and all these initiatives so that we make the best use of all of them. And then the other one, which is very useful, is that members of the civil society, humanitarian organizations, need to be a part in designing the materials for training. They need not to be left behind. We all bring different aspects, different way of looking at things, but at the same time, different expertise in the protection of civilians. So civil society, humanitarian actors, contributing countries, UN need to be bringing all those different angles so that they formulate a good training module. I think that can help also in implementation of protection of civilians. The champions of the protection of civilians and other partners, of course, as I mentioned, need to continue this advocacy using different platforms, including this one like we're doing today. So we need to continue engaging everyone. As you have seen, we have had very good questions from people who are attending this, very insightful thoughts that can help us as member states when we're doing implementing all these mandates. I think it's good to bring everybody on board. And then lastly, I think our UN Secretariat through the ITS will have a must look into the training material, and they should be adjusted, amended, and tailored to specific situations. This will be very, very useful. And I think our panelists have mentioned it several times and they have repeated it. And I think even participants have raised it. I think it will be very important again to tailor the trainings to a country specific or to country situation. Of course, we as troop contributors, of course, we need also to share our experiences in the field. And I'm happy that one of the panelists mentioned it. They are looking at different experience from different countries to give bit of lessons from firsthand of a peacekeeper in the protection of civilian. What did you learn? Probably can help us in some of the situations which may be similar, or it may trigger the mind of designers to think creatively on how we can better execute the mandates and again protect the civilians who are the first hit in most of these conflicts. Again, I want to thank you, partners. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the panelists. Incredibly good job. Personally, I have learned even a lot, and I look forward to more of these discussions. I thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. May now give the floor to Her Excellency Fatima, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Bangladesh to the UN. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I thank you, Mr. Moderator, and I thank PAX for hosting today's meeting. And my apologies for not being able to join the meeting from the start, as I was actually in another meeting co-chairing that, but I knew that this meeting was in the good hands of Ambassador Oosterholm and Ambassador Amorim. I thank both of them for their valuable remarks, and also let me also thank the panelists for their extremely insightful remarks and interventions. Thank you very much. This has indeed been an extremely rich discussion. The advice of Ambassador Oosterholm to utilize A4P platform better, and Ambassador Amorim's focus on internalizing the POC policies nationally all merit deeper reflections. The panelists have highlighted ground realities and the daunting challenges that our peacekeepers are faced with. In fact, the more we hear from the experts with field experience, the more we become convinced about the need for further strengthening our shared commitment to work for POC issues. We can't agree more on the importance of training and capacity building of the peacekeepers for implementing POC mandates in the field. However, for trainings to be effective on the ground, they must be fit for purpose and flexible enough to adjust with the evolving situations and ground realities. Keeping this in mind, in Bangladesh, we have made POC an integral component of our peacekeeping training. We have integrated human rights and humanitarian issues in the training courses. We have also placed emphasis on language skills to enable our peacekeepers to interact better with the local populations. Dear colleagues, Bangladesh has a state-of-the-art Institute for Peace Support Operations and Training, which is called BIPSOT. We wish to turn that into a global center of excellence for training peacekeepers. BIPSOT provides customized training, joint exercises, and technical support to other TPCCs. And last year, we organized a customized training of trainers course on POC in collaboration with the integrated training services of the DPO. We also host participants from different countries in our National Defense College, Army War College, and other premier training institutes. Excellencies, dear colleagues, allow me to now briefly share some reflections from our national experience. Firstly, we subscribe to the notion that POC is a shared responsibility. I appreciate the panelists for highlighting the areas where our peacekeepers can contribute better to the POC mandates in vulnerable settings. But I would like to stress here the importance of a comprehensive and whole-of-mission approach for POC implementation. There must be good coordination with the UN country team and delineation of roles and responsibilities of the peacekeepers, humanitarian actors, human rights experts, and others to protection mandates in the conflict zones. The UN family, in the fragile context, need to develop a robust partnership model based on country-specific strategies and in-mission trainings to adjust better to the local realities. Necessary measures also need to be taken to enhance the capacity of host governments. Secondly, the COVID-19 pandemic makes POC challenges more complex. We strongly supported SG's call for a global ceasefire to help preventing further escalation of violence in many conflict zones. Our peacekeepers have already taken up additional responsibilities to support local efforts to contain the pandemic spread. Unfortunately, in the line of duty, they're also getting infected. We must therefore factor in pandemic challenges in future planning and mandate setting of peacekeeping missions. We need to work together to include additional capacities, training facilities, and adequate equipment to respond to pandemic and health emergencies, as well as for ensuring the safety requirements of our peacekeepers. We can tap into the experiences and good practices of the current crisis through online trainings, consultations, cross-mission interactions, and so on. Thirdly, we strongly support women's meaningful, equal, and full participation in peace operations. Bangladesh is a strong advocate for increasing the number of women peacekeepers and to invest more in their capacity building. Women generally enjoy more trust and confidence of the community they serve and are found more effective in addressing the gender aspects of conflicts. We need to provide them with adequate training facilities in critical areas, such as reducing gender-based violence, patrolling, crowd control management, humanitarian assistance, etc. Fourthly, investing in critical enablers and capacity building of our troops and police for better situational awareness on the ground to tackle emerging threats in the POC front is also critical. And finally, Mr. Moderator, dear colleagues, it'll be important to ensure that the recommendations and best practices emanating from today's discussion are carried forward and put into practice in the field. We hope that the A4P POC Champions Group that we created last year will be able to play a catalytic role in this regard. There are, of course, some difficult issues, including the question of enhancing human and financial resources for implementing POC mandates. And the Security Council holds the primary responsibility to ensure that. We hope that with continued open and constructive dialogues, existing gaps will be narrowed down. Bangladesh will remain a strong proponent of POC issues, including training for personnel in UN peacekeeping missions. I thank you all once again for joining us today and for your important contributions. I thank you all.